We need to make sure that none of our room stations encounter interference, because if they do, that will bleed throughout the system and cause interference issues on all the room stations. What sets the DMC apart from other intercoms is we actually use Cat 5 wiring for our room stations. This gives the installer a little flexibility, able to buy the wire at several different locations without having to rely on a specific specialty retailer. In addition, it cuts the cost of the install for the installer. This is not near as expensive as our traditional intercom wire. The first thing we're going to do is run the wire from the master unit, just like we did our door station wire as well as our intercom wire. Once again, we want to pull about 12 to 18 inches for service loop, and then affix the Cat 5 opposite of the side of the intercom antennas. As we're running the Cat 5 from the master unit to the room stations, we want to keep in mind that we want to keep this as far away from high voltage wire as possible. In most houses, it's impractical to tell you to keep it completely away from Romex because it's just really difficult to do that. But we do want to keep it as far away from Romex, fluorescent lights, any other wiring that's going to carry high voltage. The reason for that is, once again, we could get interfered noise that could bleed throughout the system. We want to come down the stud cavity where our room station is located. And there's a neat little trick to making sure that our wire is right where our room station is going to be on the finish out stage. And we can simply take a screw, mount it into the 2x4 behind the room station rough end, and just wrap our Cat 5 around it several times to make sure that when it comes to the finish out stage that our wire is right where it needs to be. Keep in mind, we've only done one room station here, and in the real world, we can have up to 15 room stations and 3 door stations on each one of our DMC1. There are a few things I want to remind you before we move on to the finish out stage. When running the room station wire, you want to keep a few things in mind. One, we don't want to coil this wire up in the attic. If you take wire and coil it, it has a tendency to induct noise. In addition to not coiling them, splicing the wire or running them against sharp flashings such as you find on air conditioning units is also dangerous. It could short the system out. Also, when deciding where to place room stations, you want to keep in mind that there is both a microphone and a speaker in each one of the room stations, so feedback is always an issue. To make sure we don't get feedback, we never want to face room stations towards themselves or towards the master unit itself. In addition, if the room stations have to be on the same wall as other room stations or the master, they need to be at least 10 feet apart. And lastly, we don't want to ever have these room stations mounted back to back. What I mean by that is, if this is a shared wall between 2 bedrooms, we can't put room stations in the same stud cavity back to back, because as the speaker projects sound forward, it also projects the same sound 180 degrees out of phase behind it, which will also be picked up by the other room station. So if we follow those 3 guidelines, we should be able to make sure we have no feedback on the system. And finally, when determining the location of the master, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. Most homeowners like the location of the master to be in the kitchen. This poses a few problems. The cabinets and the countertops have a tendency to make the sound coming out of the master sound a bit funny. It's as if the music was coming out of a can because of the reflection off the bottom of the cabinets and the top of the counter. We want to choose a location that is a clear wall that's not going to be encumbered with cabinets or bookcases or any other permanent fixtures. Now we're going to start the finish out stage. We've already pre-wired the system, put in all of our rough end boxes, and the electrician has wired in our transformers into the house's electricity, and the drywallers have come in and put up all the drywall. The first thing we're going to start with is our room stations. The first thing we want to do is bring our wire, our Cat 5 wire, from the back of the rough end, straighten it out. Now we're going to need to remove the outer sheeting, and usually 2 or 3 inches is enough to install it the proper way. Now once we have our outer sheeting off of our Cat 5, you'll notice we have 4 twisted pair. It's a total of 8 wires. So we do have to untwist the twisted pair just a little bit and straighten them out. And then we're going to need to strip each individual wire just about 1/4 of an inch. Now that we've got all of our twisted pair pulled apart and stripped, we're going to take up our room station, and you'll notice there's 6 total connectors on the back of the room station, and we have 8 wires. what we're going to do is double a few of those up. It's clearly stated on each one of the room stations which wire goes to which appropriate connector. We always want to take the wire and wrap it around the appropriate colored terminal in a clockwise manner. That way, as we tighten the screw down, we don't back the wire off the connection. We also want to keep in mind not to strip too much of the insulation back, because you'll notice there's small solder points along the circuit board on the back of the room station, and if any excess wire comes in contact with that, we could short it out. Now that we've made all of our connections, it's time to mount the room station in place. You do want to keep in mind that even though the grill is metal, the surrounding piece of the room station is plastic, so we don't want to over-tighten any of the screws. It's also a good idea not to tighten the first screw down too much. That way there's a little play in the room station. You can make sure you mount the second screw properly. Now it's time to mount our door station. The first thing we want to do is pull out our wood block that we use to keep the wire in place, straighten out our connections, and we should have a 4 conductor wire with a drain. We've got a red, a black, a yellow, an orange, and an unshielded drain wire. Now for the door station itself, we need a little more room, about 2 to 3 inches of the outer sheeting removed. You'll also notice when I pull that off that there's a light blue foil insulation. That's really designed to help shield the wire from any interference, so we also want to remove that completely. Once we've removed all of the shielding, we also want to take the drain wire and cut it off flush with the outer sheeting. It's not going to be used at all on this side of the door station. We should be left with 4 wires, a red, a black, an orange, and a yellow. Now we're ready to wire them up to our door station. You'll notice that we have a red and black wire coming off the speaker of our door station, and those are color-coded directly to the red and black wire we have left on our intercom wire. I'm going to attach these using a wire nut. Now that we've wired up our speaker with our red and black wire, we're left with our orange and yellow wire for our push button. A common mistake that a lot of installers make is they use these 2 outer silver screws to connect the push button, where this is actually just a cover for our push button. The first thing we need to do is remove these 2 screws. Now that we've removed the screws, we can take off the cover and expose the 2 connectors underneath that we're actually going to use for our yellow and orange wires. Now that we've removed the cover, we just loosen the screws a little bit. Now, we have 2 colors, yellow and orange. It doesn't really matter which location each one of them goes to. The push button is a simple connection. All we care about is that once the button is pushed, we get a connected circuit and the doorbell rings. So it doesn't really matter which side we put them on. You'll also notice around the push button location where we've just mounted the wires, there's a slight cutout. That's for the cover to be replaced without pinching the wires. Now this cover serves a purpose. It's really to keep the rain and moisture off of the connection so we don't have failure of the door button. So it does need to be replaced. Now that we've replaced the cover, it's time to mount the door station. Make sure all of our wires are tucked into the box. Once again, we're dealing with a plastic door station, much like our room station, so we don't want to over-tighten these screws when we're putting them in. Now that we're finished with the door station, it's time to move on to the master. The first thing we want to do is make sure we unravel all of our Cat 5 that go to our appropriate room stations, as well as our intercom wire that goes to our door station. We also want to make sure our antennas, both the orange AM antenna and our FM coaxial antenna, are straightened out and ready to install. Once we've prepared that, it's time to bring the master unit in. The first thing we want to do is use the 3rd hand wire, and that allows us to hook it to the tab on the rough end, and we now have both of our hands free for the wiring. First, we're going to prep our room stations. Like I said earlier, we only have 1 room station in this situation, and we can have up to 15 with the DMC1. First, we're going to strip 1.5 to 2 inches of the outer sheeting off of our Cat 5.